under the sector. The oil and gas also managed to gain some 0.59%. And if you look at corn oil, there was no change, but we had some more transactions, some 17,403 units of its shares traded. If you look at Forte Oil, which has also experienced some rally lately, was trading at 28 naira, but rose eventually at rose by 5.46% last week, Friday. If you look at the transaction on Friday alone, was 542,252. And that was something that was also able to help push up the indices of the segments last week. But for 11 PLC, which is otherwise known as Mobile, it's 184 naira. There was no change in its share price, but it was 10,139 units of shares that was traded on Friday. MRS, which is also, of course, on this NSE 30 at this point, is flat, 23 naira 15 kobo. During the week, it moved at a point in time, I think once last week, it moved up in share price to settle at 23 naira 15 kobo. But on Friday, there was no change in it, and we saw just 100 deals or 100 transactions, 100 units of its shares traded by some investors. Let's look at O&O, which is now at 4 naira 15 kobo, declined some 2.35% on Friday after some 1.5 million units of its shares was exchanged. Seplat at 640 naira, no movement at all in the share price, but we saw some 25,000 plus transactions, a lot of transactions there on its units. Total 200 naira 20 kobo. It had dropped to 195 naira at some point during the week. Some investors came in to buy up those losses, and of course it regained by some percentage points during the week. But on Friday, as it settled at 200 naira 20 kobo, there was no difference in the share price. There was no capital appreciation there, but we saw some 2,850 units of that company's shares moving in favor of some investors there. Etana PLC gained 8.36% on Friday and closed at 4 naira 30 kobo. That, of course, indicates some 761,120 units of the shares. Global Spectrum is one company that hardly sees sale in the market on Friday. We saw 1,000 units of the shares, traded on the floor of the Nigerian Stock Exchange. But Japol, which has been seeing some 1 to 2 million transactions on daily basis, on Friday saw just 629,376. But of course, there was no change in the share price. It settled at 20 kobo. And this takes us to the NASD OTC, which is the unlisted securities market. We saw week-on-week gains again, some 0.26% in terms of the indices there. The USI closing at 754.40 points. Market capitalization for that market was at 541.99 billion naira. And of course, the volume of transaction for that particular week was 887.43 million units, valued at 1.22 billion naira. That's the value of all the transactions seen last week. In total, we saw 523 deals on that particular platform. And we know that that platform in recent time has implemented some initiatives around its websites, and of course around the fact that we saw some mergers and acquisition between some companies tradable on that platform. As a matter of fact, one of the most actively traded company and contributes in terms of volume to the trading we've been seeing on daily basis is Ensure PLC, and it's tradable on the platform NASD OTC. We know that going forward, over the weekend, the NASD OTC CEO, Mr. Bola Ajemale, also confirmed the fact that some companies are meant to come on board. LBIC, which is Lagos Building Investment Company, is also expected to join the tradability of that company going forward, especially in 2019. We also know that the platform looks to inform the investing public about some kind of plans for 2019. The strategic plans for this year will be unveiled on the 7th of February. That's a few weeks away. So when that happens, we should be able to bring you more information about the unquoted securities that are tradable on that platform. Let's look at the fixed income side of the market. Last week, the trends that we saw in the equities market was also cut across the fixed income markets, whether you mentioned the T-bills or you mentioned the bonds market. In terms of the bonds now, on Friday alone, alone, we saw 25 deals, and of course, that's valued at 14.07 billion naira. That's on the bond side of the market. Monday through to Thursday, we had seen the return of offshore investors on the markets. We saw a bullish trading week, except for Friday, when we now saw a quieter trading day. Yields retraced by some 5 basis points from the previous day's rally. But from Monday through to Thursday, we saw bullish trading. Players kind of reinvested their coupon payments in the market. Yields also moderated by some 6 basis points week on week, eventually to some 15.19%. We saw at the mid-end of the curve a decline in terms of the securities, the bonds tradable, and that's in that portion of the yield curve, moderating by some 10 basis points. At the long end of the curve, we saw some 16 basis points moderation, and that's of course due to the demands that we saw on the March 2027 security, which also contracted by some 34 basis points. The March 2036 security contracted by some 25 basis points. Of course, if you look at what you have on 18th of March 2036, had a lower price before now, but for Friday we saw it closing at 84 naira 54 kobo, and of course on Friday alone we saw some 6.72 billion naira units of 6.72 billion naira worth of transactions on that particular counter. We had just 8 deals across that particular security. But when you look at the short end of the curve, we saw yields expanding more by some 7 basis points, and of course that's due to the sell-offs that we saw on the February 2020 security. A whole lot of investors kind of gave their cold shoulder to the longer end of the curve on that side of the market. But let's now go to the Treasury bills market, where we saw a bit of bullish sentiment last week. T-bills basically on Friday closed flat. We saw players more interested at the longer end of the curve there, in absence of some open market operations auction. That was on Friday. But if you look at the week-on-week performance, we saw more of bullish sentiments there. It was a bullish outing last week. We saw interest. Of course, we saw increase in liquidity in the financial markets, and of course, we saw that there was demand there was more demand from the foreign investors. Yields ended up falling by some 40 basis points to 14.91% week on week on the average, and of course, we've got some buy sentiments concentrated at the short end of the curve, thereby leading to contraction by 128 basis points on that side of the curve, and of course, at the mid end of the curve, we saw marginal decline 1 basis point. We saw demand for the 55-day to maturities, which is, of course, at the short end of the curve there. At the end of the day, there was more contraction by 266 basis points. And if you look at the 132-day to maturity, there was a 220 basis points contraction on that side of the bill. However, we saw yields expanding at the long end of the curve, where investors had given some cold shoulder. There was at the long end of the curve, generally, we saw 4 basis points expansion, and there was sell-off on the 237-day to maturities. That, of course, increased some 106 basis points and closed flat eventually. However, we know that CBN conducted retail FX auctions, which mopped up some inflows from the retail FX refunds that we had in the system last week. That, in a way, had its own attendance effect on the markets generally, and perhaps informed the reason why the CBN decided not to implement any form of open market operations auction on Friday. Chimeze.
Well, Temple, thank you. I know this week is the week of monetary policy, and of course the markets, and everybody seemed to be having all eyes on them to know what the outcome would be, although a lot of people believe that the central bank will, of course, leave the interest rate unchanged. But let's see how that goes, and of course how that drives sentiment this week. Thank you, Temple. After the break, we will look at the central bank's revised financial inclusion strategy. To stay with us.